Hey everyone, so today I want to talk about the timeline in Fusion. Before we head over to Fusion, I just wanted to go over a couple clips that I've created to help demonstrate throughout this tutorial. So what I've done is I've created two clips over here. One of them you're seeing here. So all it is a 5-second clip at 24 frames per second. The 24 times 5 is 120 frames. The project that I'm working on now is currently in 24 frames per second. And all I have here is a couple counters. So I have this top one here is seconds and frames, and this bottom one here is a total of frames. So the second clip I have is recorded at 30 frames per second. So we're going to get back to this in a minute. For now, we're just going to focus on this one here. So let's select this clip. Let's head over to Fusion. And the timeline is what we want to focus on down here. So first thing to notice is the timeline by default is in frames. We're going to change that a little bit later, but for now we're just going to keep that with frames. So you can see hidden over to the left there's two bars. There's a yellow and there's a red bar. The red bar is what we're going to focus on now, and that red bar essentially is our playhead. Let's keep it over at the 0th frame for now. So we're on frame 0. We can see 0 seconds, 0 frames, and also 0 frames down here. I'm just going to use the right arrow key just to sort of jump through these frames here. So this is at 24 frames per second. So these just count up, okay? Yeah, that's all well and good. Let's just head over to frame 23. We called our first frame 0, so the 0th frame. So when we get up to frame 23, that's actually the 24th frame. So just something to keep in mind. I'm going to refer to the numbers that we see on the screen here just to keep things simple. So when we scroll to the end of the clip here and we look at our current frame, which is this box here, it says 119. That's really 119 plus 1. That's our 120th frame. So we're going to use this clip throughout the demo. First thing that I want to point out though is the frame rate that your project is at is not necessarily the same as the frame rate of the clips that you bring in. So what we'll do is we're going to go back into the cut page here. So our first 5 seconds is taken up by this 24 frames per second. So as I said, I have another clip up here that's running at 30 frames per second, and I can find that out by clicking on this little icon here. I can click on that, and down here it says the frame rate 30. I click on this icon here, frame rate 24. So these are two different frame rates, these clips. If I come over to here, to custom project settings, I can see 24 is my playback frame rate for the project. So what happens when I take this 30 frames per second, bring it down here? So I can look at this clip here in a couple different ways. First, I can just double click up here, then this clip pops into the viewer over here. So what I'm looking at in the viewer here is not this clip down in my timeline. I'm looking at this clip as it is in its original form in my media pool. And so if I take the playhead back to the 0th frame, and I'm just going to walk through these frames, and we're just going to count up 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. We're not skipping any numbers. You're going to get the full range of the 30 frames per second. So here we are at 29. One more, we flick over to 1 second, and then we're on our 30th frame there. When I come down to the timeline and put focus on the timeline, and I go back to the start of this clip here, and I'm going to walk through these a little bit slower here. 1, 2, 3, 4. Whoa, what happened there? So we went from 3 and we hopped over to 5. So that's DaVinci Resolve doing its best to strip out every 5th frame, as it turns out, to fit that 30 frame per second clip into 24 frame per second project. And the math kind of works out a little bit nice in our case. So if you take 24 and you divide it by 30, you get 0.8. So effectively what that is saying is Resolve can use only 80% of the 30 frames per second to bring a clip down 24 frames per second. So another way of saying that is strip out every 5th frame from a 30 frame per second clip, and you'll be left with 24 frames per second. So that's why we skip our 4th frame. So if we start again, 0, 1, 2, 3, up to 5, 6, 7, 8, we skip 9 and we're over at 10. So the 4th frame, so frame number 4 and 9 have been taken out, and that pattern repeats itself. 13 is going to jump to 15, 18 is going to jump to 20. All that to say, when I take this clip here, the 30 frame per second clip that has been reduced down to 24 frames per second in my final cut page timeline, if I go into Fusion and look at that, so this is my 30 frame per second clip inside of Fusion. Again, I'm starting over here at the left. I'm going to walk through these frames. 1, 2, 3, 4. There's our 4th frame. 9 is there as well. So if we take a look down here at these two values here, we see 0 and 148. So what these represent is the start and the end of essentially our render window. And that corresponds to these yellow bars that you see on either end here. And we're going to get into those yellow bars in a second, but first I want to focus on this 148. We know that this is a 30 frames per second clip that goes on for 5 seconds. So that should be 150 frames. We know with our off by 1 errors by starting at the 0th frame. So this number here should represent our last frame. It's 148 though, and it should be 149 because from 0 to 149 frames is actually 150 frames, which is what we're expecting. But this is at 148. So here's my theory as to why that's happening. And if we take a look over here and we go up, and this is the actual frame number that we're on, and I put 149, we see nothing there. So that frame got chopped off for good, it looks like here. So to understand this, I'm going to hop back into the edit page. And for those that need a small refresher on the viewers in the edit page, the viewer on the left corresponds to the actual original clip. So this is my original clip from the media pool. And the viewer on the right corresponds to my timeline. So demo underscore timeline in that case. So this clip here is this viewer here, and this here is what we would see over here in the media pool. And I've set them both up to be on their final frame. And you can see here we're at 149 as we would expect. Over here we're at 148. So I think what has happened, as soon as I pull from the media pool down into the timeline here, I think because I have a 24 frame per second project that final frame is getting cut off. But when I go into Fusion, I think that final frame is getting cut off for good. And remember, the frames that are getting cut out of the 30 frame per second clip are frames that end in a 4 and end in a 9. And those correspond to essentially every 5th frame. So since frame 149, the very final frame, ends with a 9, that gets cut off for good when I drag it down to the timeline here. But when I go into Fusion, I don't see the 149th frame because I think that's been cut off for good. But I do see all the other frames that end with 9 right there, for example, within the clip. So to recap, when I'm looking in a timeline in the edit or the cut page, these clips have their frames stripped out that will correspond to the frame rate of the project that I'm in. When I go into Fusion, I'm going to see all the frames in the original 30 frames per second in this case, but the exception is that the end of the clips might get truncated a little bit. So whether that matters or not, I'm not so sure, just something to keep in mind. Okay, so I switched focus back to the 24 frames per second clip. And this one here, we see our render range is from 0 to 119. So that makes sense. That's our 120 frames. And these two values here correspond to these yellow bars, as I was mentioning earlier. So what I can do with these bars is I can just click and I can drag them to wherever I want. I can also set values in here. So if I just want to set this to start at 30, and I'll take the end bar and I'll say, let's bring that down to 60. So what I did there is I set up my render range to start here and end here. And that's only going to affect previews that I see in the Fusion page. So if I play this here, you'll see that my playhead is just looping in between these two areas here. I'm just going to stop this now. I'm going to go back into the cut page. What I didn't do is really affect the original clip. Now remember, this is this first 24 frame per second clip. That's still intact and working as I expect. And you'll notice when I come back into Fusion, it's reset those start and end points of the render range. So that render range is pretty helpful when I just want to, if I'm doing an animation that just sort of happens in a section over here, and I just want to loop over that quickly and sort of see what's happening as I make changes. Now you'll notice we're dealing in frames here, and I'm always starting off on the 0th frame here. Well, the reason that starts off on frame 0 is because when I imported my original clip from the media pool, I have no in and out points set. So I'm just going to double click on this here. So now my viewer is showing the original clip here. And I'm going to set my in and out points. I'm going to start at 1 second, let's say, and I'm going to move over here to 2 seconds. So I clicked I to set my in point, and I clicked O to set my out point. Now, what's going to happen here on my timeline is when I drag this clip down, it's not going to add the full 5-second clip as it did previously. It's only going to add the 1 second clip here that corresponds to my in and my out points. Now, when I select this clip and I go over to Fusion, I'll have to select it again here in Fusion, it looks like. So this is my 3rd clip. Now I see I don't start from frame 0. I start from frame 24 in this case, and I go up to frame 48. So the default values of your render range are going to correspond to what you've set as your in and your out points on your original clip. And if I go back into the cut page, and I'm going to just pull this in by doing a trim, for example, then I go back into Fusion, I can see that that's moved down to frame 37. It was up at 48 or something before. And just a quick tip, one other way I can set the render range is hold down Control Command and just drag across. Alright, so back on the cut page, I've cleaned things up a little bit, and we're just looking at a single clip, 24 frames per second. There's no in and out points, it's the full 5 seconds. So we go into Fusion, and we see here we're looking in terms of frames. Maybe that's not what we want. So if you can come up here to Fusion, Fusion Settings, and you go to Defaults. Down here under Timecode, you can say Show Timecode, and you can set that up in a couple different ways. So there's the SMPTE timecode here, and feet and frames as well. So I'm going to select SMPTE or SMPTE, which stands for the Society of Motion Pictures and Television Engineers. So let's choose that, and we're going to go Save. Now you'll notice right now that did not change anything down here. So I found switching between these different formats for the timeline a little bit buggy and a little bit inconsistent. So it's probably best just to pick one and sort of stick with that. So here's what I did. So I just switched the default to the SMPTE timecode, and just to give everyone a refresher sort of on what that is, that's this format here. So that's hours, minutes, seconds, frames. If I go back over to Fusion, nothing has changed down here. I'm going to come back to the cut page, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to add the exact same clip right beside it here. And I'm going to select that one, and I'm going to go into Fusion. I'm going to come up here to Clips, and I have my two clips here. There's the first one here, and there's my second one here. I'm going to select the second one, and now if you look up here, you'll see this in terms of seconds and frames. It doesn't have the minutes and hours because it doesn't need to in this case. Again, if I come up and I choose Fusion Settings, and now I'm going to choose feet plus frames, I go Save. That doesn't change anything. I come back to the cut page, I take a third clip, put it down there. I keep on selecting it here and then going into Fusion, but that doesn't matter. You have to select it again inside Fusion. So I'm going to select this one here, and if you look at now we see feet and frames. So I come back to my second clip, SMPTE timecode, first clip, frames. Now here's the crazy part. I'm going to save this. I'm going to close down DaVinci Resolve. Okay, so I'm back in DaVinci Resolve right now, and I look at my first clip. This was in frames before. It's now in feet plus frames. Come to my second clip. Feet plus frames. Feet plus frames. So all these now, when I started the project again, are going to take whatever the default setting is here. In this case, feet plus frames. So I'm just going to turn that off, and we'll leave it in this format for the time being. So these first three clips here are actual clips. They're not Fusion compositions. So what I've done is I've repeated the same process with 3 Fusion compositions. And these Fusion compositions are essentially just, if I go back to the cut page, this text plus here. This is a Fusion composition. So I've repeated the same thing here. If I click on this first Fusion composition, that's in frames. Second one in SMPTE. Third one in feet plus frames. I'm going to save that. Let's reboot here and see what happens. So I'm going to close DaVinci Resolve, be back in 1 second. Okay, so now we're back in our project, and let's take a look at things. So remember, before I exited the program last time, we were set up in feet per frames. So what we've learned from our last little trial here is that all these 3 clips here, so these are clips and not Fusion compositions, these 3 clips here should change back to that default setting. Feet per frames on clip 1, same on clip 2, same on clip 3. Let's take a look at what's happened to these Fusion compositions. The first one, which was originally frames, still frames. Second one, SMPTE. Third one, feet and frames. So to summarize, when you're working with clips, whenever you load your project, that's going to go back to the default value that you've set up here. However, Fusion compositions seem to remember what you've set for each one. Why it behaves that way, not 100% sure. So one final test I want to run. So I'm going to highlight the second clip, and we're in feet plus frames here. I'm going to change this clip into a Fusion element. I'm just going to grab a whatever node, a blur node in this case. Holding down the Shift key, I'm going to insert that in there. And you'll see this little icon shows up here. So before I close Resolve, I'm going to come up here. I'm going to change Go into my defaults. I'm going to take this off completely. I'm going to go save. And let's see what happens. I'm going to quit resolve. I'll be back in 1 second. Okay, I'm back again and we restarted. So this clip here, we see it's now changed to our default setting, which is frames. And I go to my second clip here, which is now a fusion composition, and it's held on to its feet plus frames. And our third clip here is back to frames. So again, it looks like fusion compositions have memory, whatever you set when you import the clip, whereas clips always go back to the default value when you start your program, when you start the program again. Okay, one other thing I want to talk about is caching. So this little green bar that you see down underneath the timeline, this green bar is showing that this frame is cached. So there's no green bar that goes across here. So none of this has been cached into RAM yet. And if you look down here in the status bar in the bottom right, it shows you how much of available RAM that I'm using. So I have 16 gigs on my machine, so I'm at 70% right now. So I'm going to play this a little bit. I'm going to play it sort of up to frame 24, 25. I'm just going to push spacebar to run, and then I'm going to stop. And so what you see now is this green bar is filled in. So all those frames up to now have been cached. This is pretty simple, so I don't really care too much about caching for something that's this simple. But when things get more complex, when I start to bring in some particle effects or whatever, things can bog down pretty quickly, and caching can certainly provide you a benefit. So one thing to note here is when I right click down here on these transport controls, I right click on this, I'm set up at high quality right now. So that's showing a high quality render in the preview pane. I'm going to take that off right now. And I'm going to play a little bit more. So these first frames up to frame 31 have been cached in high quality mode. I'm going to run a little bit further up here, and I'm going to stop right there. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to right click back on here, click high quality, and you'll notice that that second set of frames shows up now as a red bar. So what that means is the low quality preview has been cached, but I'm in high quality mode right now. So if I want to look at these in high quality, I'm going to have to go back and sort of rerun over these to cache them again. So if I come back here and I click and I take off high quality, then it snaps back to green. So if I'm going to go back into high quality mode, I'm going to come back to here, for example. I'm going to play a little bit further, and now I've cached these frames here in high quality mode. So the very last thing that I want to talk about is how I actually set up these counters here. It's really quite simple, and there's an excellent tutorial by Mr. Alex Tech, which I'm sure you guys have all seen his YouTube channel. It was a tutorial of his that I'll link up above that I got this idea. There's a very small variation that I've done, and that's possibly because the feature that I'm using didn't exist when that original tutorial was written. I also noticed that he's got a charity drive on right now, so head over to his channel, check it out. You probably already know it. You've probably already been there. Fantastic channel, lots of great information. So I'm going to head over to the edit page here real quickly. I'm going to just select my timelines, and I have a timeline that's created where I actually generated those videos. And just as a very quick aside, so this is how I use timelines to help actually do these tutorials. So my demo_viewer was one of my previous tutorials, demo_timeline. That's when I'm actually recording. I'm using this timeline here, and my main_timeline is the actual video that I'm going to be uploading. So pretty handy to hop back and forth. And these two here are the actual clips that I create here. So let's go into the 24 frames per second one, and I'm going to head over to the world of Fusion once more. And it's a pretty simple node tree here. What you see is essentially 3 text plus nodes, 1, 2, and 3. I'm going to click on the seconds and frames one. So that's this second one, or this middle one here. So what I can do is I can go over here to the style text, and when you right click on this, I don't have the option now because I already selected it. You come down and you can select time code here, and that essentially will delete any text that you have in this text box here, and will put this in automatically. What you can also do then, come up to modifiers, and modifiers allows you to choose between hours or seconds or whatever you choose to display. So if I put hours on here and minutes on here, then I see the full SMPTE time code show up here. So in any case, that's how I did that. Thanks so much for checking this out. I will talk to you all soon. Bye.